Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On here, we talk about all things to increase performance, better body composition, and do it all without destroying your health and the flexible approach. Today on the podcast, I've got Dr. Jennifer Heisz. She's the director of the NeuroFit lab at McMaster University. A great new book that just came out recently called Move the Body, Heal the Mind. How to overcome anxiety, depression, and dementia, and improve focus, creativity, and sleep. So we talk all about the connection between neurology and exercise. What are some things you can do if you have anxiety, ADHD, and just fascinating research on how the body and the mind are more connected than what we probably realize. And research is doing a much better job now of investigating this. So we give some examples there of how exercise can literally change the structure of your brain, can change thought patterns, help establish just overall better thinking. So I think when we list a lot of benefits of exercise, myself included, we tend to focus solely on the physical side, and for good reason. But there are a ton of mental benefits associated with it also. And this podcast is brought to you by the Flex Diet certification. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. And you can learn about 8 interventions to improve performance and body comp and health via nutrition and recovery. So in there, we talk about one of the interventions is protein. And we've got an interview with Dr. Stu Phillips, who works at McMaster University next to Jennifer Heisz just down the hallway. We also talk about carbohydrates, fats, walking, intermittent fasting, keto, sleep, and much more. So go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com, and you can get on the wait list for the next time that it opens, in addition to lots of great information on the daily newsletter there. So sit back and enjoy this interview with Dr. Jennifer Heisz, author of Move the Body, Heal the Mind. Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. And today we're here with Dr. Jennifer Heisz, who has a brand new book called Move the Body, Heal the Mind, which is great. I picked it up and I've been really enjoying it so far. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So what was your desire to write a book? It's one thing for you to do research. It's another animal to write a research-based book for the general population, as I'm sure you probably figured out doing
it. Yeah, totally different skill set for sure. But writing books has always been like a lifelong dream of mine. And I'm always interviewing people who've written books. Oh, how'd you get into it? Why'd you do it?
Yeah.
And for me personally, I feel that, as scientists, it's really important for us to communicate our science to the general public because they need the knowledge that we have. And I just happen to have this very personal attachment to exercise and mental health that I think lends itself to a really nice story that gets wrapped around the research in my book. So my own personal struggles trying to make exercise part of my life, my own challenges with mental health issues around anxiety and OCD, and then finally finding exercise as the medicine that I needed for my mind, which really made a shift in both my research and in my personal life. So before I got into the exercise neuroscience research we do in the NeuroFit lab now, I was just a fundamental neuroscientist studying how the brain represents who we are. And it all happened in grad school. The stress of the situation really triggered maybe an underlying vulnerability in my brain. And I was reluctant to take medication. Unfortunately, I somehow stumbled. On a whim, I borrowed my friend's rusty old road bike, and
Mhm.
those bike rides soothed my mind and really had a profound impact on both my personal and professional life. And so I wanted to share all that with people because I think that especially young people, but also older people, they need to see representation of people who, quote unquote, look successful, but have mental health issues or have learned to manage their mental health issues at various degrees. And especially now, since the onset of the pandemic, things like mental health issues of depression and anxiety, they can really arise in anyone at any point in life. And so a lot of people during the pandemic, because the situation was so stressful, they, for the first time in their life, were experiencing symptoms of anxiety in the form of, tightness in their chest. It felt like they're having a heart attack. Maybe they go to their cardiologist, and the cardiologist is just like, well, it's anxiety. That's what
Mhm.
anxiety feels like. But for people who've never felt it before, it can be really terrifying. And so sharing stories is really important so people know they're not alone. And then backing those stories up with science, I really saw it as like a really great opportunity to make a meaningful impact on the world.
Yeah, and I think sort of mental like illness or struggles or disease or whatever word you want to associate with it is much more common than I think most people realize. Like, I mean, I work in the fitness space, and even just some of the people I've been able to work with who are, let's say, semi-public, for me, looking at them before I got to know them from the outside, I was, holy crap, this person does that. They run a gym, they do all this stuff. And then when you get to work with them on a more personal level, you realize, wow, they've actually struggled a lot, or they still are struggling with things going on where I think from the outside looking in, it's more common than what we realize, but the general population or most people, and I didn't realize this either, if we only view them from the outside, we don't see what's really going on. And I think it's much more common than what we realize because of that.
Yeah, well, unlike physical issues that are very obvious, often obvious, these mental health issues can remain a secret, for a long time or forever for many people. And for me, that was the case. It remained a secret, and there's a lot of shame around having issues with your mind because our whole identity is wrapped up there, right? It's all wrapped up in the way we think, the way we feel, that it's difficult to dissociate, the biological underpinnings of this dysfunction from who we are as people. And I think that's why there's still so much stigma around, sharing stories or, around mental illness when there really shouldn't be. It really is just a biological disorder that needs medical or some attention, some management in some way.
Do you feel that that's getting better? My biased thought is I think we're almost at the point where books like yours, there's a lot more level of awareness. I'll pick on guys, especially guys seem to be worse about it than women. I know it's a broad overgeneralization, but even in that area, especially in military and other areas, I see that it's becoming a lot, at least much better than I've ever seen before, which I think is a move in the correct direction.
hmm Yeah, well, I guess when you have any form of illness, it feels like a weakness, right?
Right.
And especially for men, that can be really demoralizing to admit that if in your own perception you wrap that up with weakness, when in fact it's not weakness, it's biology, and biology gone wrong in this case that needs correcting. And so if you just try to avoid it, then it's not going to get any better or go away. And that can lead to a worsening of the situation when it could have been managed better. So the statistics are interesting because the research shows that females struggle more than men
Hmm.
than males in terms of mental health issues. But I think this is just a reporting bias. I
That
think
was my
that,
next question. Is that
mhm,
underreporting on guys? Probably would be
yeah,
my guess.
yeah, because if you look at suicide rates, for example, they're higher in men.
Yeah,
And
much higher, I
so
think.
they're much higher in men. And that to me is so just so heartbreaking, that that it's it's allowed to get to the point where the situation just feels completely hopeless. And so the hope for me is that we can stop it before then, you know, so that we destigmatize it. It's not a weakness, it is a dysfunction, and it can be corrected, but it's difficult to do it alone, and you don't have to do it alone. I think that's a really important messaging.
Yeah, I think it's like anything else. Like it's okay to seek professional advice, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I consult with my CPA because I don't know dick about doing my taxes. I know what I should track. That's about it. You know,
Hmm.
people work with personal trainers, they work with coaches of all types. It's, I guess, in my mind, it's not any different if we throw out all the social stigma and admitting weakness and that type of thing. It's a similar idea, and I think that's starting to become a little bit more accepted now.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that the fitness space is actually a really beautiful place where we can start to intervene. So if you know you have this mental health issue and you're too afraid to talk to your doctor, or maybe you don't want to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that doesn't, you can see your coach, you can see your fitness trainer. And so what we've tried to do is, in the ACSM health and fitness magazine that is like available for coaches and clinicians, is we've tried to talk about how coaches can start prescribing exercise for conditions like depression or anxiety, or just even if one of their clients is overly stressed. So what we find in our research is that, especially with athletes, they're much more comfortable talking about, being stressed or being overloaded at work or school than they are about saying things like, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, so
Mm-hmm.
so if there are words that you can kind of cue on, like stress is one. It's such a colloquial word now, but if a client seems to be stressed, then what you can do is you can tweak their exercise program so that you avoid stress overload. So this is a really cool fact about the link between mental stress and physical stress of exercise. So there is only one stress system for all stressors, and this includes psychological stressors we feel during our day, as well as exercise stressors that we feel during the workout. And so when you have these psychological stressors in your life, and then you try to layer on top of that exercise stress, sometimes if the stress in your life's too high, it can push you into the like allostatic load, stress overload, where it actually starts to weaken and damage the body rather than strengthening it, which is what you want. And so what we recommend is there's like a lowering of the intensity, especially when you're feeling more anxious or stressed out or burnt out from work, focusing more on duration of the exercise rather than the intensity can be a really helpful sort of cue.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you recommend any technology, heart rate variability or heart rate or anything to try to get a handle on stress? And obviously, I'm biased. It's a loaded question because I do a lot of heart rate variability work. And what I found over time was the same conversations I would have with people in the past about stress. It was easy for them to kind of run away from it and even almost change the language they were using again. They're like, oh, I said I was stressed, but I wasn't really that bad. Where if they see a metric on their smartphone and I can see it, I'm like, hey, what was going on here? It was much harder for them to sort of run away and admit that nothing was going on when you see this trend going down of a marker of physiologic stress from their body, which I found allowed me to actually have deeper conversations with them because now they sort of acknowledge the elephant in the room and they can't run from it. And they're then trying to figure out how do you deal with it.
I love that idea. And actually, we just started getting into measuring heart rate variability in my lab too.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it is a really nice marker of stress and one's reaction to stressors, right? Where higher heart rate variability is more healthy, and lower is really less healthy and unhelpful. And this also underscores this interplay between psychological and physical stressors, right? And how we can use exercise to tone the stress system, to increase our heart rate variability, and to strengthen that parasympathetic nervous system so that we're less reactive to even just everyday stressors in our life. So, yeah, I like that idea of using a metric. I guess, in your experience, are the smart watches good at capturing heart rate variability to the point that they could be reliable for such a metric?
Eh, Generally, I would say no,
Yeah.
right? Because the new Apple one is pretty good, although I'd want to see more data on it. The problem is because it's doing the optical pickup off of the wrist is where most of them are. To get heart rate variability, you have to pick off that R wave, right? So that peak for
Mm-hmm.
people who are listening within literally a couple milliseconds, right? Because you're just looking for these really, really tiny changes from one heartbeat to the next. Like the Aura Ring does it off of the vessel in your finger. So that one has data showing that it's pretty accurate. The downside with that is it's done laying down during the course of the night. So if
Mm.
your sleep is a little bit different, or you're a high level endurance athlete where your resting heart rate is super, super low, right? You're always kind of in this parasympathetic tone. So these other stressors kind of get washed out a little bit. So I'm still kind of old school where I do the chest strap first thing in the morning. I use the iThlete app instead of athlete.
Mm.
It's just iThlete. They've got several studies that have shown that it's pretty accurate. And it's just a 60-second measurement. So once you get to steady state after a minute or two, it's just 60 seconds to grab the data point. So it's not too intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
And then that allows you to change position depending upon their resting heart rate. So vast majority of people are going to be fine doing it seated. But I've got a couple of higher level endurance athletes where they actually have to do it standing, right, to try to get them out of that. It's
Mm-hmm.
called parasympathetic saturation, where their parasympathetic tone is so high, the stressors don't show up. You put them in a standing position, obviously their heart rate is going to go up a little bit, but that position is then a constant every day. So when you run the variability analysis, you're just still looking for changes and it's more accurate.
I love that. I think that would be really helpful to track the impact of psychological stress in their life, but also training overload, right?
Yeah.
So how we can prevent overload, because I think it's really the amount of stress that people have in their life, their mental health stress, can really actually lead to a stress overload and burnout in athletes. And I don't believe that it's very well understood and respected within the sports community that the psychological stress has such a big role in that, and that coaches and athletes need to tailor their exercise programs depending on how much life stress they are dealing with at the time. I think this is what we've seen in top high end athletes lately, where the highest end gymnasts are not even able to compete in the sport that they've trained their whole life to do,
Yeah.
like Simone Biles. Like to me, just I don't understand. I don't know the whole situation for her, but I just look at it and think, well, if they were trying to push her in the same physical regime that they had been doing the whole time without considering her mental state, then of course she's gone into stress overload. Um, and when you're in a state like that, not only does it make you not physically able to do the exercises, but mentally too. Like you're not able to focus and concentrate and compete at such a high level that you need to. Like especially in these high end sports, it's not just a physical sport. It's a mental sport too.
Yeah. And I would argue that once you get to that level, it's probably mostly mental, right? I mean, like if you look at Olympics, right, the last
Hmm.
or couple of weeks before a big event, you're probably not getting any better per se on a physical level. But mentally, your job then is just to repeat all the great training that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about all the stress that goes into it. It's 4 years you've been training for it. Some athletes have only one event and maybe only one time trial once they've qualified. Just the elevation of stress is pretty high. And like you said, then if you add, something else happens in their life, most have to travel to get there, everything else. Even with athletes, like for doing HRV, I've lost track of how many athletes have come back to me, because I have on the Athlete app, they have little context indicators. So they can put down what was your nutrition, what was your sleep, and they can put in a little notes. So I tell them, like, if anything changes or something weird, or even if you don't think it's related, just put it in the notes. So that way, if we do see changes in heart rate variability, we can go back and look and see what's associated. Because like you said, sometimes it is training, sometimes it's nutrition, sometimes it's emotional things. And I've lost count of how many athletes have come back. They're like, yeah, man, my HRV was tanking for like 2 days and I couldn't figure it out. And I look in their notes and it was some, like emotional or psychological thing they dealt with. They didn't think it was any issue. And I'm like, yeah, that was probably it. They're like, oh my gosh, that's so weird. I never thought that in stuff that you think like, oh, we had an argument with my wife, my dog passed away, things that we would all associate are stressors, especially in athletes. It just seems like it's hard for them to realize that will show up in the physical side also. It's like they're very good at segmenting the two. But I think even just that level of awareness to be like, oh yeah, that, can definitely have an impact. And what's fascinating too is that some athletes more than others. A buddy of mine told a story of pretty high level professional athlete he was working with, came into his facility. He's driving into the facility to train him, and he sees this athlete show up on ESPN for something that was not very good. He ended up, getting arrested, had to spend a night in jail, whatever. And so he's thinking, he's like, oh my God, this athlete's going to be like destroyed. We're going to have to change this whole training. Comes in, does all the HRV analysis. Everything's fine. He's like, hey, we're, this thing that just happened. He's like, I don't care about that. He's like, really? You're like on national TV for this. He's like, whatever. So it's fascinating to me how that's completely different from one person to the next. And the question for you is, so an event will happen, but how much of that stress response do you think is also related to the perception of what the person kind of thinks about that event?
Oh, 100%. 100% related to perception. So
Yeah.
this is where mind over matter comes into play, and sports psychology comes into play in a big way, is that when we stress is directly related to our amygdala, which is our threat detection center. And that is an evaluation that you're making on the situation. So you are deciding how big a threat this is, what the threat is. And this is where we can get into a lot of trouble, because real threats, like, being chased by a lion, versus perceived threats like, oh, I performed terribly and I'm going to get cut from the team, they activate the stress system in the same way. And the brain has no way of communicating the nature of that stressor to the body. And so the body reacts in exactly the same way. And so the storyline that we've created and the amount of threat associated with that storyline carries a huge role. It can activate the amygdala, which is the threat detection center, and that can send shockwaves into the body. So, for example, this player, they've obviously developed some interesting strategies where they're able to dissociate themselves from, from issues. And I mean, that could be good or bad. Maybe that's leading to some dysfunction in other parts of their life. And I think it is, it's good to have a healthy amount of awareness of repercussions of actions. But we want to make sure that we are in control of that conversation, and that if so what can happen is then, if the threat detection in the brain sends shock waves into the system, sending a stress response there, then the brain then reinterprets that stress response in the body, and then that can escalate the stress that you're feeling, the threat that it senses, activating it even more, and it creates this like vicious cycle where it really can get away from you quickly. And this is where it's really helpful to have, reframing techniques in mind, or just, some self-talk where you come back to the facts, come back to what are the facts, because we can create a story in our mind that gets well away from the facts and is based on a lot of assumptions. And I find a really helpful technique when I'm kind of trapped in my negative thinking is just, okay, well, what are the facts? What can we really trust and believe? And that is often a really calming way to center yourself.
Awesome. Also related to that, is there a way we can do some movement practice? I'm thinking like simulation-based training, or some people have called it like threat inoculation, where you could do a graded maybe stimulus of some kind and do well, and then sort of just like exercise graded back up again to reprogram both the mind and the body.
Yeah. So we call that exposure therapy, and
Right.
it's a way to expose you to the thing that you fear or threat, that you see as a threat the most, in a safe space, in sort of micro doses, right? So that you learn to face it, overcome it, and realize you're still safe. And that helps to train both the mind and the body to be less reactive to that kind of stressor. So in the book, I talk about exactly this for people who have anxiety sensitivity. So people with anxiety sensitivity, you may or may not have an anxiety disorder, but you can still have anxiety sensitivity. And it's the fear of the body sensations of anxiety. So the heart racing, difficulty breathing, and coincidentally, those are the same symptoms that vigorous exercise induces, right? The heart racing, difficulty breathing. And so people with anxiety sensitivity really don't like exercising vigorously. They'll go out of their way to exercise. And what they need, though, the best medicine for them, is to expose themselves to vigorous exercise. And so in the book, I talk about these really short bursts of high intensity exercise for people with anxiety sensitivity, even just a few seconds, just to activate the system, to feel the heart pounding and to stop, and then to feel it come back down to baseline, and repeat that, and keep repeating that until it's not scary anymore. So you've dissociated the physical activation of the body, which isn't bad, that can get you ready for the performance, ready for the task, ready for the competition. But it's the thinking around that activation that can derail everything that you want to do, right? So it's really is trying to convince the mind that this is actually safe, that there is no real threat here, and that we can be at this high level of activation and be okay.
Oh, that's great. And there's some interesting data you've probably seen too about biochemical modifications of those pathways. Like, so I'm thinking about some of the studies they've done with like MAPS, a sponsor with MDMA with PTSD, and there's some interesting data on using like propranolol and beta blockers with exposure therapy also. Any thoughts on that? As similar idea, but more of a biochemical component to it?
Yeah, so I think this is essentially in the way that we can use exercise to start modifying the brain, right? So there has been really great evidence to show that, especially for people who've experienced trauma, for example, whether it be war veterans, those who have higher levels of this neuropeptide Y seem to be protected from developing things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And we can make more neuropeptide Y with exercise. So it seems to be this like resiliency factor. And the really nice thing about neuropeptide Y is that you don't need to be exercising vigorously to have it build up. It increases even after mild exercise, and stays elevated during that acute phase after the exercise. So that, in a way, it's that kind of micro dosing where we're supplying the brain with a reset. And I think exercise can really provide that in a safe and like harm-free way. The microdosing with, MDMA, it seems very promising, but there's also a risk associated with that. And I think that the science is really promising, but I would just, there needs to be more. We're not quite there yet. So if somebody needs something to turn to, I think exercise now is just such a powerful, available, safe way to induce similar resets in the brain that we would expect from drugs in these microdosing studies. And it's really interesting that even mindfulness techniques, there's a lot of interest in mindfulness techniques and meditation techniques, which essentially these, like MDMA, is essentially enhancing the sensory perceptual experience to bring you back into the present moment, which is essentially what mindfulness training does and what exercise can do if you're focusing on the right things. So in the book, I talk about how we can focus on attention to breath even while we're moving, and that can make the movement more mindful, or focus on, the experience of clenching the muscles and moving the body through space. It doesn't have to be like overly positive, but just focusing on the experience and in the moment. And I think that based on all the things that the other stuff do to the brain, that is enough to reset it. And so why not try it with exercise as a way to sort of rewire the brain away from trauma and pain.
Yeah, I mean, my bias is I'm not an expert in these areas at all, but I think the future will be probably a combination of different therapies, and we'll probably have a better idea of who maybe better response to certain things. And then also you have to look at, from a intervention standpoint, what is a potential risk versus reward, right? I mean, I think exercise has, some risks, but they're relatively low. Most people have access. Most people can do it on their own. Yes, getting a coach, getting someone to help you can be beneficial, but it's a much easier access point, I think, for a lot of people. And my guess is that for long-term success, you would have to, at some level, incorporate some type of movement, I think, is my gut feeling.
Yeah. And I think, when we think about the use of antidepressants, for example, they're one of the most widely prescribed drugs on the planet, and they're prescribed for a host of mood disorders, but they don't actually work for a third of the people who take them. And so this one, blanket approach to all forms of mental illness, it has got to change. And I think that, bringing in exercise into the conversation, bringing in other therapies and techniques into the conversation is an important step in starting to change that, because for those people who don't respond to antidepressants, actually they respond a lot better to exercise, and see clinically significant benefits in improving their mood. So that I find that really a powerful piece of evidence to suggest, how much exercise can change and reset the brain, even in cases where they have a clinical diagnosis.
Yeah, my thought patterns on that too is, so for example, I've had people do a lot of work on the rower,
Hmm.
concept 2 rower, and they're trying to hit a certain, let's say, average watt or time. And if you're doing it pretty all out, it's miserable. It's not a lot of fun. But I think the skill set that you learn over time to put up with, realistically, every part of your body telling you to stop, but it's not painful enough that you're going to permanently injure yourself, but it's not fun. But I think there's definitely a transfer in that skill set of being able
Hmm.
to focus on the average watts to keep going. And then when you're done, you definitely feel a lot better after. But I do think there's something to just the ability to focus on that at a very elevated level of stress. I just feel
Hmm.
that that skill set under those conditions transfers to other aspects of your life too. And I think we kind of underappreciate how beneficial that could be.
Oh, so much. So part of my book includes this journey that I was on from, sedentary to triathlete, and it
Yeah, tell us
ends.
about that.
Well,
You don't
it
have to give away the whole book, but
it ends with me completing an Ironman, which is something I never thought would be humanly possible for me. And such a grueling one day event, and just exactly what you're saying. Like, it becomes such a mental game to push through the agony and the pain and the brain telling you, well, let's just stop. Like,
yeah, this is a horrible idea.
this is
Stop.
horrible. Like, why are we doing this? And it really takes so much resiliency to push yourself beyond your comfort zone. And it's amazing that the resiliency it takes, but you get all that resiliency back and then some, and you can start applying that to your life and seeing things that look like obstacles when you realize, maybe I can do that, and it just builds your confidence, not just in the sport but in life too. And I think that that's just, it's such a powerful gift that you get from exercise.
Yeah, and I think the added practice too of benefits of seeing small wins that are like tangible that you can't talk yourself out of. Right. In your
Hmm.
case, I rode my bike longer. I rode it faster. I did the swimming. I completed an Ironman, which congratulations. That's extremely difficult to do. And even just people lifting in the gym. Oh, I did 2 pounds more this
Hmm.
week. I did, more volume. I did a faster pace. There's probably some direction you can move in an intelligent manner. I think being able to see sort of the immediate outcome of your effort. There were a lot of other tasks at work or whatever. It's very delayed, it's very fuzzy, I think. But to have that confidence of, oh, okay, I can do this. Oh, look, I did put in the work. I am seeing these small incremental benefits over time has very powerful.
Yeah, but I also think that that can actually be a deterrent to a lot of new exercisers.
It can
So
be, yes, especially when
uh,
you're new.
when you're new and you want results now and you're
Right.
supposed to
It's
look
never
like
fast enough.
that, it is not fast. And so I'm trying to shift the conversation for, especially for new exercisers, around, working out not to look good, to lose weight or to be stronger, but to focus on the goal of feeling good, which you get immediately after every single workout. And so we need those quick wins, especially at the beginning. Research shows that how you feel during those first few workouts predicts whether you're going to stick with it in the long term. But yes, to your point, those of us who already, have bought into the idea of exercising daily for life, um, these performance gains are super beneficial to keep you motivated. But we can also focus on the mental gains too. Like, I'm sleeping better. I'm thinking more clearly. I'm more productive at work. I'm more creative. Yeah, it really is. It's amazing all the benefits that exercise gives to both the body and the brain.
Yeah, I agree. And I think from a neurology standpoint, the more benefits we can kind of stick exercise to, it gives people more reasons to do it. But I think it also literally teaches their brain how exercise is medicine and how powerful it is. So I've had clients who are newer to exercise, especially more than I worked with general population in the past. like list out some of the benefits, 2 months into a program than when they started.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the things I'm looking for are not even associated to body composition or whatever. It's like, oh, I sleep better. I have more energy. I can play with my kids now. Oh, my right knee doesn't hurt. Like trying to get them to realize the transfer of all the benefits they get from exercise. And my hope is the more that they see that, that'll hopefully get them to stick with it longer instead of just, I was hoping to lose 15 pounds. I've only lost 5 pounds, and, try to get them out of this kind of myopic view of it.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so important, especially when the protester is the brain. The brain
Right.
is like, oh, we're too tired. We don't have time for this. But if the benefit is for the brain, it does help you to get over that inertia and get moving.
And have people, I think, realize that it's fascinating to me how humans are just so hardcore survival wired, right? Even things like exercise, that even someone who's been exercising for decades of their life knows how beneficial it is. They'll probably still get it done. But even yesterday, like I have a friggin' gym in my garage. Like I don't even have to walk 10 feet to get in there to do anything. And it took me like a half hour. I'm like, I don't know if I really want to go. Like, and it took me 40 minutes to get into the session to feel like I was doing something productive. And I ended up hitting like a PR that I wanted to hit. And like I've been doing this shit for 30 years. I still have these conversations with myself. I can imagine what it's like to be new, where you don't have that experience to fall back on. It's very easy to have your own brain literally talk you out of doing the thing you want to do.
Exactly. And I hear you on that. It's so easy, and yeah, it is a hardwired feature of the brain. It's a relic of our evolutionary past, and it makes sense. I mean, back in the day, we had to expend a lot of energy to hunt and gather our food, and when we weren't doing that, we needed to conserve energy. And so any voluntary movement was seen as an extravagant expense, and the brain didn't want you to do it. So it would protest, prevent. And so flash forward to now, exercise is a voluntary movement, and the brain sees it as an extravagant expense that it's trying to prevent you to do. And so fortunately, we've evolved some, more logical, rational parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, that can help, calm down, reassure that lazy brain that, resources are plenty. We can do this movement. I like that the science around swishing in a sugary drink into your mouth.
Mouth rinse studies on performance.
Yeah, the mouth rinse studies, how they help to improve performance, and you don't even have to ingest it, which is really interesting. And I think that's around convincing the lazy brain that resources are plenty. So it's like a reminder, okay, there's sugar. Sugar's available. We can go do this workout. And people are able to put in more effort. And the other thing, to your point about, once you start moving, it's easier to move, right? And so I have this mental health mode of exercise that I evoke, where if I'm not feeling up for it, I negotiate with myself. It's like, okay, well, we'll do the workout, but if it was supposed to be like a 30-minute jog, we'll do like a 30-minute walk run. So I take off the intensity, I keep the time in. But it's amazing that once you start moving and you start jogging, then you just keep going, and it's just it reinforces itself. And that's because once the muscles are contracting and moving, then the neurochemicals are being released, some by the muscles, some within the brain, and they're just creating that sensation of reward, pleasure, and feel good.
What are your thoughts about, in that case? I think of it as making exercise more open-ended. So I have this thing lately where for most people, it's just violent consistency. It's just doing what you can on a almost day by day basis. And that you're going to have some days that are amazing. You're going to have some days that are average, and you have some days that just completely suck, but I think the more you make the performance outcome something that, yes, you want to chase, something you do want to hit, something you can see that you've made progress. But the paradox at the same time, like you were saying, is, can I also make it open-ended? Can I just show up like what I did yesterday? Can I just show up whatever I get is what I get. That was the best I could do at that point without, trying to incur any high risk or do anything crazy. And that's better than what I would have done, which is sit on the couch and do nothing.
Yes, right.
Right. But I think
Yeah.
those compounded over, days to weeks to months to decades is where people make progress. Or I think it's harder when you're new because you remember those really amazing sessions and you don't have the experience to know that even in advanced athletes, that's not daily, right? I think there's this sort of fantasization of all these advanced athletes are hitting all these PRs like every day. And that's like so far from the truth that I think if, like you said, just make it more open-ended, do the thing and then see where you end up, I find is easier to get your brain to do it.
Absolutely. This consistency is key, especially over the long term, because this is a lifelong journey. And the other thing is if we're trying to go for personal best every single time, that could be too stressful for the body and actually be counterproductive, right? So I love this idea of, just showing up. I work with a coach and she's planned my workouts, but she doesn't talk about intensity or pace, right? At least right now, I'm not training for anything. I'm just, training for life. And most of us are doing that. And this idea of training for life is really about consistency and persistency and finding a way to move your body a little bit more every day.
You want to talk a little bit about exercise and like physical structural changes to the brain? Because I think that's one area people may not realize. So like the example I think of is the studies that have been done with aerobic exercise, increasing hippocampal volume by, was it like over like 50%? It was something pretty crazy.
Yeah, so the research, is really fascinating around the hippocampus. So there's been rodent studies, so animal models where they run on a running wheel, and you can actually count the number of newborn cells within the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a brain region that's critical for memory. It's also what's damaged by Alzheimer's disease. And there's significantly more newborn brain cells that are born in runners' brains than non-runners' brains. It really is really a magical thing. And this is a relatively new area of research. Maybe in the past decade has really come to life. The first study to demonstrate this was in 1999. And before that, people were speculative about whether the adult brain could actually produce new brain cells.
Right. That was the old thing where like, oh, you only have some X number of neurons, and if you killed a bunch, too bad for you.
I know, but that's not true. And the brain is plastic and like changing and forever able to produce brain cells throughout the lifespan. And exercise is the most powerful stimulator of that. A really cool new finding is that why is exercise so powerful? Well, it may have to do with lactic acid or lactate that builds up in the muscle. So everyone's familiar with lactic acid associated with that burning sensation. And
lactate and hydrogen ions.
Yeah, the hydrogen ions creating the acidic environment. Right. So when lactate moves through the blood into the brain, it actually goes right to the hippocampus and can produce growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which increases the birth of these newborn brain cells and enhances their functional integration. So it's really a fascinating new discovery. And within humans, they've shown that aerobic exercise, even just brisk walking, is enough to reverse some of the age-related declines in the hippocampus, both in healthy adults, but also in people with Alzheimer's disease. So it is really fascinating that there's not just these neurochemical changes that can happen in the brain, but also these structural changes, like really changing the gray matter.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how, I mean, for so long, it's been, especially in academia, we've split off neurology from muscle phys to like, they're all in their like their own little siloed areas. And you just keep learning time and time again that they're just so interrelated to each other. And the
Hmm.
BDNF thing, I think, is just fascinating, right? So it's a compound that potentially is released from the muscle or a byproduct of the muscle that's, as far as we know, not really that active in the muscle, but actually triggers changes in your brain, which I
Hmm.
find is just fascinating.
Yeah, super fascinating. Right. And even other growth factors like vascular endothelial factor,
Yeah, VEGF.
VEGF, yeah, that promotes angiogenesis in the brain, so the birth of new blood vessels, which helps carry more oxygenated blood to the prefrontal cortex, especially to help enhance focus, concentration, creativity, but also helps ward off things like vascular dementia, which can impair our executive functions. Yeah, so super fascinating stuff.
You want to talk a little bit about ADHD and exercise? I mean, it just seems like there's, again, I don't know if the rate of ADHD is going up or we're getting better at diagnosing it or if it's a combination of both, but I've seen anecdotally more and more clients with it. And I've also noticed over the decade that the ones that just do a lot of volume of, I'd say, high quality exercise, like most of the time, unless they've got some weird stuff going on, like their ADHD symptoms, at least from my side, I'm not trying to diagnose anything, appear to go down. And many times they've
Hmm.
been able to work with their doc to go off medication almost entirely. But
Yeah.
yet, if you talk to most people, exercise and ADHD seems like a little bit of a weird area.
Hmm. We study this in my lab. I have a student working on it right now, and exactly what you're experiencing with your clients is what the research supports. So the benefits of exercise seem to mimic what ADHD drugs do to the brain, increasing dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, increasing blood flow, oxygenation. And it's really amazing. It has a profound effect on improving executive functions, which are, our higher order cognitive abilities that allow us to focus our attention, ignore distractions, and this is critical for paying attention in school and at work. And most of the research has actually been done in children,
Mm-hmm.
showing really strong effects. And the research we're doing in our lab is on adults, and the benefits seem equally good in adults. One thing that's really quite fascinating, actually, that surprised us, it's not published yet. So,
Ooh, even better.
um, is that people with ADHD often are comorbid with depression.
Hmm.
And this combination of ADHD and depression together really compromises their ability to focus because concentration is also a symptom of depression. But what seems to be really beneficial is exercise for this subgroup of people with ADHD who have high depression. And I think because it helps not only with their ADHD symptoms, but also with their depression symptoms to have like a double whammy effect. It's just super fascinating, this link between our ability to pay attention and our mood, and how exercise can really help bolster both, to help people better engage with life.
Oh, that's super fascinating. One of my, I don't know, I guess if I don't say favorite theory, but one of the theories I like for explaining that as a spectrum is called the entropic brain theory, if you've heard of
Mm.
that. Basically, what their argument is that all sort of neurologic diseases should be put on sort of a spectrum.
Mhm.
And that has to do with how much sort of variability there is in it. If you
Mhm.
go to the left end of the spectrum, someone who's, say, a schizophrenic, they're just so variable, like they have a hard time functioning. If you go all the way to kind of the middle area, maybe you've got ADHD, maybe you've got depression, where you just get stuck and you have almost no sort of cognitive variability and you feel
Mm.
trapped. And
Mhm.
so it's interesting because if it's true, who knows, right? It's very hard to show data to support or disprove a lot of those theories. But if it is true, then that kind of means that exercise may be beneficial because it may be enhancing different parts and you see overlap between these
Mm.
different diseases, which historically we've kind of put in their own little silos of like depression here, ADHD here, schizophrenia here, or it seems like we're learning that they're probably more maybe degrees of similar processes, and that exercise and other things can have these kind of pluripotent effects on the kind of the spectrum itself too.
Yeah, it's cool that you bring that up because research that I did in my postdoc was on looking at the entropy of brain signals.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so looking at whether there's an optimal amount of sort of quote unquote noise that has
Right.
to be present in the variability of the brain response. Yeah, so that is interesting to think about, and I think that that's probably true along one dimension at least,
Right.
where if we just look at how the neurons are communicating their signal, there needs to be a certain amount of variability, but then it probably depends on where that deficit in variability is in the brain that leads to different symptoms.
Right.
Right. So, yeah, that's super cool. I haven't really thought of that in a long time, but fascinating research on the brain variability. And I guess that would make sense given that you're interested in heart rate variability and there's the alignment, the match there.
Yeah, my PhD was on fine scale variability differences across physiologic systems. So looking at metabolism versus heart rate versus other systems. So I think the entropic brain theory is Roger Carhart Harris, I think. I could be wrong on that. So awesome. So where can people find out more about the book and pick it up, find out more about you?
Yeah, so the book is called Move the Body, Heal the Mind, and you can buy it anywhere books are sold. You can learn about my research at neurofitlab.ca or my backstory and look at some Ironman footage at Jennifer Heisz, HEISZ at .com. JenniferHeisz.com. I'm on Twitter at Jennifer Heisz and on Instagram at Dr.JenniferHeisz.
Awesome. And Stu Phillips said to say hi.
Okay, hi Stu. Yeah, we work down the hall from each other.
Oh, okay. I know you're at the same facility. So.
Yeah, since the pandemic, I haven't seen him much except just like this over Zoom, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely weird. I would imagine it's even more weird to be in academia now with everything being more virtual too. So
yeah, how do you know Stu?
Just through exercise phys stuff. I stalked him for years, going to conferences and stuff like that. So
yeah. Oh, he's so awesome, such a supporter, such an amazing
super nice guy.
colleague.
I've done a few podcasts with him, and always just super nice and gracious with his time. And he's also very good at explaining things. Like some researchers are really good at research, but they're not the best at explaining it.
Yeah, he's got a good skill. Yeah,
explaining it too, which is great. So
yeah. Good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your time today. I really appreciate you coming on here. This is great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. Big thanks to Jennifer Heisz for coming on to the podcast and sharing all of her wonderful knowledge in her new book. It's really great. I'm enjoying it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. And it's a real nice blend of hardcore research, nice stories, anecdotes, and it was really well done. So I'm really enjoying it. So I'd highly recommend you check it out. And this podcast is brought to you by the Flex Diet Certification. So go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com, and you can learn all about 8 interventions to improve body composition and performance using the flexible approach, all without destroying your health. So we talk about protein, carbohydrates, fats, fasting, and much more. So go to flexdiet.com. You can get onto the waitlist there for the next time that it opens. Thanks again for listening. Really appreciate it. Any comments on this, please leave them in iTunes or whatever your favorite player is. And if you enjoyed this and you think someone else may benefit from this content, please forward it over to them. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again next week.
What was that? It's called the medium sketch.
The medium sketch?
Yeah, it wasn't rare, and it certainly wasn't well done.